House of Wolf, Part 3. Amalie kept an eye on her grandmother through the morning, staying close to her in case she showed any other signs of stress. However, Charlene was in high spirits and seemed to have forgotten all about the incident by midday. Until the American couple came back from town to have their lunch, and Charlene held them hostage at the ancestral portrait wall. So I've shown you the paintings of our patriarch Lucien and his lady wife Marie Theresa, and all their progeny. But this is the one I wanted to show you. We just got it, she said, pointing to the small photograph of Babette. This darling child was the personal servant to Marie Theresa, who from all accounts was very fond of her. The American man, who had looked florid and bored, suddenly frowned. There are no photos of your ancestors, but there's a photo of their servant? Photography was expensive back in those days. Why would they commission paintings of themselves and then waste money on a photo of a maid? His thick gray eyebrows raised. Good point, Amalie thought. Charlene seemed flustered, and she stared at him with a blank expression. She reached trembling fingers to the gilt frame. In a low voice, she continued her story, as though he had not interrupted her. Babette was very special to Marie Theresa. It said that Marie Theresa treated her like one of the family, and even taught her to read and write. It was highly unusual for a mistress to care for one of the staff in this manner. Slave Gran, she was a slave. Amalie sighed, feeling exasperated by her grandmother's genteel approach to the family history. She had already put the nonsense of ghosts out of her mind and was convinced she must have seen the child of one of the estate workers. However, the deep, dark sadness in such a young girl's eyes haunted her. It was lunch, and the cook, Mrs. Roberts, had prepared a Jamaican menu of jerk chicken, baked barbecue pork ribs, with mac and cheese and potato salad, as requested by the American guests. Amalie sat next to the American woman at the dining table and, in anticipation of an uninterrupted feast, began with the juicy, succulent jerk chicken. But to her surprise, the woman began to talk to her. I want to say I'm sorry about what I said in the carriage. I didn't mean nothing by it. The woman smiled, but Amalie was slightly annoyed. Couldn't she have apologized after this obviously delicious lunch was properly consumed and digested? With reluctance, she turned her attention to the woman. I'm Beverly, and that's my husband, Roger. We're staying here for another week, and then we go off to Barbuda. Beverly was trying very hard to be friendly, and Amalie decided to meet her halfway. I hope you're enjoying Antigua, she responded politely. Oh, yes. Those white sand beaches are just stunning, and everything is so charming. And your grandmother is such a colorful character, Beverly said and smiled. Amalie winced at the patronizing tone, but decided she would just focus on her meal. Beverly chatted on about she and Roger traveling the Caribbean for their 30th anniversary. Amalie tuned out most of the chatter, but then something caught her attention. Wait, did you say a most haunted tour? Amalie paused from gnawing on a rib bone to stare at the tourist. Beverly looked put out. I've said so at the start, hun. We're touring the most haunted colonial plantations in the Eastern Caribbean. Fuchs had one of the best stories, and so we knew we had to stop here. We've been picking up all sort of paranormal activity here. Her round face was flushed with excitement. Amalie put the rib back on her plate, appetite gone. She had no idea her ancestral home had an international reputation as a haunted house. She had a flash of insight as she recalled Charlene explaining Babette's photo to her guest. This was a marketing ploy. She took a sip of fresh grapefruit juice and paid closer attention to Beverly's non-stop ramble. So naturally, we hope to make contact with Lucien or Marie Theresa. That would be amazing. But if we could speak to Wolfgang, whew! Beverly pursed her lips in a soundless whistle. Amalie stared at her before it clued in that it was not her cousin Wolfgang, but his namesake, the brother of Lucien Fuchs, who Beverly meant. The original Wolfgang was a bit of a mysterious figure whom she had only heard about once as a child, when her father referred to insanity running in the family. He had been having an argument with Charlene at the time, so Amalie had thought nothing of it. This woman knows more about my family history than I do, Amalie thought. It was disturbing, but it wasn't her fault. Her father, Klaus, was a disembodied voice on the phone on birthdays and holidays. She hadn't seen him since she was 5 years old. The hurt and anger she endured and eventually covered over with a veneer of indifference began to surface now, as a stranger told her things that her father should have. So when Lucien moved the family here in 1816, he brought his wife and his brother Wolfgang, and they started growing sugar. That's a charming story of how the great house got its nickname. The slaves unpacking the trunks from the ship saw the engravings of the Fuchs family crest, which was a silhouette of a fox with its jaws open, as you know. But the native thought it was a dog or a wolf. So for years they called the Fuchs house the House of Wolf. Beverly tinkled a laugh, and Amalie had to smile at her enthusiasm. Her smile disappeared as Beverly leaned in and lowered her voice. But by 1822, everybody knew something was wrong. No, more than wrong, evil about the House of Wolf. Did you know they had the highest turnover of slaves on the entire island? They kept dying or running away. Some of the traders refused to sell to them. Beverly's flushed face was serious, and her eyes were wide. Evil? What could be more evil than owning slaves? Amalie retorted. Well, yeah, that for sure, but there have been stories about slaves getting torn to shreds by wild beasts and their ghosts haunting the estate. And then, of course, you know about Wolfgang. Beverly suddenly seemed to realize she might be on a sensitive topic and leaned back. She glanced over to the top of the table where Charlene was chatting to Beverly's husband Roger, who looked hot and unresponsive. Amalie sighed. No use pretending. Actually, I don't know about Wolfgang other than my cousin is named after him, she admitted. Oh yes, I realized that. I thought it was so quaint. But imagine naming somebody after that character. But I guess it's a family name. Beverly patted Amalie on the forearm. Amalie gritted her teeth. Beverly had a manner that just rubbed her the wrong way. You were saying? She tried to refocus on the conversation. So in 1830, Wolfgang, who has always been a bit eccentric, I guess is the word for it, starts attacking the slaves whenever there's a full moon. He's described as covered with thick, dark hair on his arms and face, and he's just deranged. So Lucien had him institutionalized at the local sanatorium, where your hospital is. Forgot the name. Beverly called over to her husband in a loud voice over the other conversations. Roger, what's the name of the hospital where the old mental institution used to be? The one where Wolfgang was locked up, she asked. Charlene put her hand to her chest, and Amalie could see she was utterly shocked. Rage rose up in her at the American woman's lack of tact. Hoberton, Roger said without looking up from his plate. He seemed unaware of the sudden silence. That was just dumb, Amalie snapped, and got up quickly to go to Charlene, whose face was still pale. She did think Charlene was taking it rather hard for a piece of ancient history. But Charlene did seem to put a lot of pride and stock in the family name. Charlene gave a nervous chuckle. Oh, I thought you meant my Wolfgang. It was such a shock. How foolish I am. Of course she couldn't mean my Wolfgang. Her voice trembled on the last few words. Amalie patted her shoulder, feeling the protruding bones under her linen dress. Charlene made an effort to pull herself together, and then she smiled brightly at Beverly, who looked affronted. Yes, that's right. Lucien had to have him locked away. It's a tragic story, really. There was never any proof Wolfgang had done any of those terrible attacks, but his physical appearance frightened people. Can you come with me a minute, dear? She turned to look at Amalie. Amalie nodded quickly as she saw the tears gathering in her grandmother's eyes. They excused themselves from the table, with Charlene leading the way out of the dining room. In the hallway, Charlene half turned and took Amalie's hand, and her knees buckled. Amalie rushed to support her. They were in front of the wall of portraits, and Charlene again seemed drawn to the one of Babette. Just give me a little more time, please, she whispered. Gran, why did they take this photo of her? I know she was like some kind of pet to Marie Theresa, but why immortalize her? Amalie asked. Charlene didn't respond at first, her eyes riveted to the small photograph. I didn't know they had taken one. I saw it for the first time this morning, Charlene murmured. You didn't put it up? Amalie asked. Charlene shook her head. So how do you know this is Babette? Amalie demanded, perplexed. Charlene looked at her through watery gray eyes. I've seen her. Here in the house. She appears to me at different times. She's a lost, lonely, angry child. We must give her peace, Charlene explained. Amalie had no words for this, so she stayed silent, her brain working furiously. There's no such thing as ghosts. They went to Charlene's room and went in, where Charlene went over to an antique desk and unlocked a drawer. She took out a small booklet bound with old leather. She handled it with some reverence and then gave it to Amalie, who accepted it automatically. Amalie examined the book and discovered it was a journal. The ink was very faded, and in some areas words were illegible. It was old, and the yellowed pages were water and age-stained. The letters were shaky, and the spelling seemed strange. But there, on the very first page, was the author's name. I am Babette, of 12 or 13 years of age. Amalie read out loud and glanced at Charlene in shock. She wrote a journal? How? Amalie turned over the journal in her hands carefully. Charlene smiled. I told you, she could read and write. She was a little secretary for Marie Theresa. She wrote about the family and the things that happened at that time. Charlene's voice became heavy with sadness. I believe it was because of this book she was killed. But her life was hellish even before then, Charlene sighed. She was a slave, Gran. Of course her life was hell, Amalie reasoned. Yes, but you will understand when you read it. She and the other slaves lived with a fear that none of the other plantation slaves on the island had to endure. They thought the devil lived at Fuchs and would steal their souls. They feared not only the whip, but also the moonlit nights. Amalie felt the stirring of something unpleasant within her. I don't believe in ghosts, she repeated to herself.